Okay, today is August the 22nd, 2017. Excuse me. And we prepare ourselves in our usual fashion. Before we do, I want to remind you that this Friday is Fun Friday. And so if you want to come and have fun, this is the place to be. 6:30, thereabouts. Okay, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Heavenly Father, we're so thankful that you are the God of freedom, that you are the God of righteousness and justice. We are your children. We are to stand for truth, righteousness, and justice as well. We thank you that all the grace that you have given this country throughout the years, and now it seems to be unraveling, and so we go to you in order to be able to know what to do and depend on your grace even more in our lives so that we can be good and faithful servants. We pray that you will give us an open mind this evening, help us to focus, help us to transfer what we learn into our cardia so that we can use this information for your glory. And we pray this in Christ's name. Amen. We're not going into discernment again. In fact, I've decided that this is going to be part 4 of the Monument series, and I might change it to Monument Moving Madness. I'm not sure what I'm going to call it yet, but this is part 4 anyway. It doesn't matter what you have, I'm going to change it. So, because I haven't completely made up my mind yet. I think that I'll just start with, I have a few prepared notes, but they're going to be very short because I'm going to be quoting out of a book for the most part. The removal of 100-year-old Confederate monuments is sweeping our land, and the motivation for this is the assumption that the South was evil because they fought the North in order to preserve slavery. If this is proven to be true, then their whole house of cards comes falling down. That's the sand that they built on. But everyone is taking that without question. Now, why is that? Well, one reason is because we weren't taught any different. I've learned so much out of this book that I'm going to impart to you because I didn't learn it in school, and I don't think you did either. And one reason is because to the victor goes those who are going to write history in favor of themselves. And so much that is in this book has been buried. It has been hidden. And because you don't remember any of this, because it wasn't taught, then all of us fall prey. We're easy prey, easy pickings for the lies that are said over and over and over again. I've heard this so many times, it's as if everybody understands and accepts the lie that the South was evil because they fought the North in order to preserve slavery, which is a lie, which I'm going to prove conclusively this evening and even after that. I remember the only thing I can remember in the school of this era was I was forced to learn the Gettysburg Address. And I still know most of the Gettysburg Address. I didn't know what it meant. All I know was if I was going to get a grade, I had to memorize it, and I can still remember most of it now. But I didn't know what it meant. It didn't mean anything to me. And that's pretty much all I took away was having to memorize something that really didn't mean much to me. We didn't have very good teachers then, and I don't know, the history that was taught was either revised or else it was hardly any history at all, which I think is the case today. I propose to demonstrate that this assumption that the South fought the North in order to preserve slavery is a lie so that you will know the truth, and having the facts, you will be able to rebut the lies and stand for truth and righteousness so our beloved country will change direction and avoid the wrath of God. That's why I'm doing this. I've already taught the rationale and the logical approaches to this and giving you principles that are logical and rational But what I'm going to do tonight, and I don't know how far I'm going to get, I'm going to make a concerted effort not to rush. In fact, if you get lost in the weeds somewhere, if you don't understand something, raise your hand, but don't do it unless you just are lost, you're confused or something, because I have so much to cover, and I want to cover as much as I can, but I don't want to go into some issue that you are discombobulated and you can't go forward. So I want y'all to understand this. You know, life is so crazy. On the way here, I heard a very interesting bit of information. It just, the whole tenor of our lives, as far as that goes, especially concerning our country, is turning upside down. Insanity is ruling. And I heard on the way here that I think it was in Baltimore that there was a mayor. Did you hear it? Don't say what it is. Wasn't it Baltimore?
Yes.
Okay. Recently in Baltimore, they took down Confederate monuments in the dead of night. Nobody voted on it. Nobody had a say other than, I guess, maybe the city council. And there was a mayor that was presiding over that, and not the taking down, but when it was installed, when this monument was installed, there was a mayor there of Baltimore that praised it and said what a wonderful thing that is. You'll never guess who it was unless you heard this that Ron heard on the radio. It was the father of Nancy Pelosi. Was the mayor of that city when they put up that monument that they took down recently in the dead of night, which of course she said that every Confederate monument needs to be removed immediately. And here her father was one that was lauding it when it was given. Now, all quotes that I'm going to be giving tonight is going to be taken from this book. This book is the one that I'm going to be teaching from. I'll let you see it here. It has beautiful artwork in it as well. You can see some on the cover. It's The War Between the States, America's Uncivil War. Now, this book was written by John J. Dwyer, and he signed it for me in November the 17th, 2006. I went to a conference, and he signed it for me, and I was so glad that I received it. This is essentially equivalent to a college textbook. It's 668 pages long. Don't worry, we're not going to go over the whole book.
What's the name of the book?
It's called The War Between the States, America's Uncivil War, by James J. Dwyer. Bubonic publisher, copyright 2005. I want to read a couple of the acknowledgments before we get started. This will say something about it. The first one is from Thomas J. DiLorenzo, professor of economics, Loyola College in Maryland. I don't know if that rings a bell with you, but he wrote a phenomenal book that I would recommend to anyone called The Real Lincoln. And it is phenomenal. Anyway, this is what he says. The way in which historians describe the war between the states is by far the worst case of political correctness that I have witnessed in my 26 years at the university as professor. Thankfully, at long last, we have an antidote to this in the form of the beautifully written and well-researched book, The War Between the States, America's Uncivil War. It is comprehensive, learned, and beautifully presented. Every family in America, especially ones with school-aged children, should own it and study it. Here's one by William Murchison, senior columnist, the Dallas Morning News, best-selling author of Reclaiming Morality in America. He says, it's clearly written, suffused with Christian knowledge and understanding, it stands out a mile. Then you have Donald Livingston, professor of philosophy at Emory University. He says, partial truths are more dangerous than open falsehoods, as error is more easily concealed and more difficult to uncover. The history of the Civil War taught in secondary schools is typically a partial truth that conceals more than it reveals. Dwyer corrects this error not by adopting a sundered point of view, though that view is rightly included, but with a magisterial account that comprehends both in a tragic story the most Americans have yet to confront. Marlon Laurie Detweiler of Veritas Press says, we must both know, listen to this very carefully. By the way, I'm not giving all what they said, I'm just taking little lines here and there. We must both know history and think biblically before we can unify our thinking in Christ. We must know history is important, contrary to what some of the people have said recently. And then we have Lou Walkwell, president of the Ludwig von Mises Institute. He says, finally, a readable, comprehensive book of the Civil War that does that horrific event justice. Using all the best scholarship and the skills of a born teacher, historian John J. Dwyer has provided homeschooling parents in private and Christian schools with just the book they need. None of the usual pap here. We learn the real reasons for the war, how it was fought, and the truth about Lincoln and what happened afterwards. It was with this monstrous event that America went off the rails. But it is not too late to return to the ideals of the framers. John J. Dwyer shows us how to do that. And then the last one here is by Rodney J. Marshall, president and headmaster of Cormandillo Academy. He says he exhibits the courage to challenge long-held biases on both sides of the divide with unvarnished facts. That's what I like about it, because I'm going to give you a lot of facts tonight. If you want to remember them, get your pad and pencil out, because I probably won't be going over them again. I recommend it to my colleagues in classical Christian education as a text for studying America's uncivil war. Those are a few of the things that we see of those that acknowledge what kind of book this is. This book, like I said, has 668 pages. The first 11 chapters deals with the causes of the war. Chapters 30 through 38 deal with the post-war reconstruction. And then, pages 196 through, it goes chapter 12 through 30, deal with the war itself, the battles, and then the rest of it deals with the war of the post-war reconstruction, and reconstruction is in quotation marks. Now, here is a quote from the introduction of the book. Now, this is the first thing that I'm going to read you from this book. He says, people fought for many different reasons, and slavery drove neither the United States nor the Confederate States to war. That's right off the bat in the introduction. It is true that the Founding Fathers' vision for America and their Constitution were derailed, not preserved, by the war, its outcome, and especially its aftermath. So what I'm just telling you is completely contrary, opposite to what so many people think. The debate over the national government's role became a referendum on whether it or the state governments had birthed the federal union and whose authority held primacy. In other words, most people have never been taught all of the acrimony, all of the arguments, all of the things that occurred over people in our country were trying to figure out who's really in charge. Is it the federal government, or is it the people? Is it states? What is it? Then the last part of this quote, the South was crushed and the North had to abandon not only the precepts of its own constitution, but those of its biblical, of its Bible to win. In other words, to win, they had to sacrifice what they knew was right in the Bible and what they knew what was right in the Constitution. Still, it took a decade of misguided post-war, again, reconstruction in quotations, to form a nation very different from that birthed by the founders in 1789. So what he's saying is, and this is true, but nobody tells you this, is after that war, it was decided what kind of government we were going to have and who's going to be in charge. And it wasn't the government that the founders had envisioned. That's what he said. To form a nation very different that was birthed from the founders in 1789. Dwyer had 4 distinguished men who were contributors to his book. 3 out of the 4 men were pastors, and one of them was a principal of a secondary school. Each one of them had authored several historical books about America's uncivil war. One of these pastors had written 12 books already just on this era. This is the last thing in the introduction. There were many factors that contributed to the war of 1861 to 1865. Generally, it had to do with the differing visions America held for what their government and their country should be, and where the ultimate authority for both should lie. The conflicts evidenced themselves in the disputes over the nature of states' rights, including but not limited to secession and nullification. I would suggest to you that if you were talking especially to the younger people today and you ask them, do you know what nullification is? Do you know what secession is? I doubt that many of them have even heard the terms, and I would say that probably even fewer than that would even have an idea of what they mean or how they're pertinent to us today. So the first thing I'm going to do, I've been putting markers. Now all these markers, can you see all the markers? Let me take this out. See that? That was before I started working on this project for this series, a little mini-series I'm doing here. I'm going to turn all the way to page 73, and then we're going to drop back to page 5. But I wanted to start with this because I think it's a good thing, because what we're talking about is what was the war fought over? What was the issue or issues that motivated people to go against even family members? There were so many families were split up where you had maybe one son in the south, one in the north, or it was just incredible how polarizing it was. So I start here by saying, though millions of Northerners supported their section's war effort against the South in the 1860s, they did so for many reasons, and they posited a variety of views on slavery. At least 4, sometimes overlapping but nonetheless distinctive major groups can be identified. So he's going to give 4 groups here of ideas or motivations why people went to war. It just wasn't one reason. And the North was so much different from the South at this time, because the North had all these immigrants coming in from Europe. Most of them came through New York, and they started changing the fabric of the North. So different, and they became an industrial complex where the South remained slower in agriculture and so forth. All these things were taking place that made changes as well. But here are the 4 that he gave. Number 1, he says, the industrialists, the Industrial Revolution took place in the North, not in the South. The industrialists, whose chief desire was to protect the industrial interests of the Northwest and maintain the South as a place of resource. We're going to go into that big time some to see that in one large sense, the war was fought over redistribution of wealth. And there was tyranny in the North that was pushing it. You'll understand all this hopefully momentarily. But they had their reasons to lord it over and have it over the South, because they had industry that had to continue to prosper. Another reason was the radical centralists who desired revolution along the lines of Marx and Engels. The Communist Manifesto and remaking the nature of the nation with centralized national government possessing unchallenged authority. Marx came on the scene in 1848, which was right in the middle of all this taking place. And some people don't even know that that was even known about in America. But there were Americans, to one degree or another, that wanted a centralized government. And I'll go in just a moment. I'm going to go and show you what these people were called. And it was different from what the founders wanted. So that is another category. Some wanted to just wipe away the nation and start over and as a communist country. Others wanted mainly to change the founding fathers' ideal of a limited government and make it a centralized government because they thought it would be able to provide everything people needed. That was the second category. The third were the abolitionists, part of a larger category of reformers who wanted to bring salvation by ridding the world and America in particular of social sin. And of course they thought the social sin was slavery. And as we go through this, we're going to see something about the abolitionists, and they are so closely, when they are described, you would identify them in a heartbeat of how they operated with Black Lives Matter and with the Antifa. These type of organizations are perfectly identify with the abolitionists. You see, the abolitionists wanted that all slavery would end immediately and there would be no compensation to the people in the South. Now, you might think, well, what's the big deal about that? You'll see. But that was the third group. And the fourth group were the unionists, not talking about unions, labor unions, but those who wanted to keep the union. The unionists comprised a final group whose chief desire was to preserve the union intact. So that would be those, you probably have heard over and over that Abraham Lincoln said that he wanted to preserve the Union. Well, in Thomas De Lorenzo's book, The Real Lincoln, was saying what he meant by that was he wanted a centralized government. And that in order to have a centralized government, you have to preserve the Union. So those are a few reasons, just to get kicked off, that there wasn't just one reason, but there were several reasons. Americans tended to think independently and in terms of their regions as opposed to some super political power. By and large, they did not think nationalistically. Now, what I can say that really characterizes this, just about everybody today thinks in the terms as what this says, nationalistically. Where back then, they didn't think in those terms, because back then, when they were talking about the United States, they would say, the United States are. Why is that? It wasn't an overall overreaching nationalism. It was independent states that made up the United States. So the United States wasn't a national entity in that sense. It was a group of sovereign states. So when you would say the United States are, you understand? But today, what do we say? The United States is. That's a nationalistic type of thinking. And that's what everybody thinks today, or nearly everybody. This is illustrated, by and large, they didn't think nationalistically. This is illustrated by the major political philosophies that emerged from the 1780s debates over the Articles of Confederation. Y'all know what the Articles of Confederation was. That was before the Constitution that we have today. When America won the War of Independence, the first thing they had was the Articles of Confederation. And so during that time, there are three groups that he's saying actually existed at that time. The Nationalists, which I just gave you an idea kind of what they were. The Federalists, I'll give you a definition in a minute of those. And the Localists. And he says, though these were not necessarily the terms by which they were referred to, this is three basic groups that thought different ways, that had different reasons why they either supported the war or did not. First of all, the nationalists wanted a single American superstate with centralized government and a nationwide uniformity on all levels. That were the nationalists. There was a group that thought that way. Then you had the Federalists. The Federalists, such as Alexander Hamilton and initially James Madison, desired a strong central government, but with significant powers left to the states. Okay? Now, a lot of people would sign on that today. They say, well, yeah, that sounds fine. It's kind of a balance between the central government and the states, and they're okay with that. Then you have what he calls the localists, that would be even closer to home, who comprised an anti-federalist movement, believed sovereign power should remain with the states except for those enumerated powers they agreed to consign to the federal government. Bingo, that's where I sign on to. I don't know where you would be, but that's where I would be. Then it goes on to talk about, let's see, where am I? I got to get my bearings here. Where do I go to from here? Okay, page 16. I had to go through and mark where I'm going to go next. Here's something about nationalism. Nationalism fostered the idea that bigger was better, that strength and power ought to be invested in a centralized government, which in turn would become sort of a benevolent social engineer, fixing the woes of society through legislation and education. Blah. And yet people buy in to that blather. They did it then, and they're doing it now. Of course, we know the more power that you feed a beast, the more powerful they become. But that's kind of an idea of nationalism. So then we go to states' rights. This is what he has next. The rights of the states to serve the people by using powers accorded to them by the social compact theory. I'm going to give you that in just a second. And we're not subservient to a centralized national authority. When you think about states' rights, the first thing you think of is that they are not subservient to a centralized government. That's what states' rights is about. And this is explained in the social compact theory, which he was just related to. It says, this theory of government states that regarding human authority, the people are sovereign. Okay? Do you like that? That does mean they are sovereign under God. He doesn't say that, but it's understood. They establish state and other local governments and delegate limited authority to them. The government is obligated to protect the people's inalienable rights, such as life, liberty, and property, and the pursuit of happiness. If the government abuses its power, the people have the right to alter or abolish it. That was the social compact that those who believed in states' rights would sign on to. Thomas Jefferson and eventually the fourth president, James Madison, insisted the states retained ultimate power over their own destinies. Upon the answer to the question hinged another question: the constitutionality of a state's right to secede or leave by its own volition the Union without consent of the federal government. So we're getting right into it right now because this is what happened in history. The Founding Fathers gave us this kind of government where the people were in charge. The government could not act apart from the consent of the people. And if the federal government got too big for its britches, the people could alter it or abolish it and start over. However, of course, and do you know what the federal government did? How long did it take the federal government before it got too big for its britches? The second president, John Adams, have you ever heard of the sedition acts of that period? Now, this is only the second president. And he comes up and says, anybody that says anything bad about my government, we can lock up. What happened to the First Amendment? See, it's been under attack ever since we got started. And of course, he mainly had that pointed or targeted the newspapers. And he did shut down newspapers, and he did throw newspaper people in jail because they said something that wasn't flattering to his administration. So it didn't take long before this happened. And so this issue of nullification and secession, it wasn't a long time before it happened. Right off the bat, we hit a stump, if I can put it that way. Now, when considering the constitutionality of the Southern secession in the war, two questions loom. First, from the time of America's War of Independence from England, did the states claim the right to nullify laws passed by Congress if the states deemed them unconstitutional? That's a question. Do you know the answer to that? From first time of the Americans' independence from England, did states claim the right to nullify laws passed by Congress if the states deemed them unconstitutional? I don't know if you know the answer to that, but the answer is yes, they did. The other question, the second, was did the states claim the right to secede from or depart from the central government if they chose to, if it was necessary for their happiness? Did that happen? You won't read it in most history books. It happened big time. When considering the Declaration of Independence and other major events in early American history, the answer to both questions seems clear. Numerous states from one end of the country to the other claimed or threatened to exercise such rights up and until and even into the war. See, the people think the only people that ever decided that they were going to nullify something or secede from the Union was the southern states. It happened from the second president on. These things were grappling with these threats, and people were serious. They were going to leave the Union. And, yeah, most of them, well, yeah, they're mostly northern states. It says that in just a moment here. So, so perhaps the third question we should be asking, were the states correct in asserting the rights of nullification and secession? The answer lies in the historical documents of the American War. And what one do you think he's going to bring up first? The Declaration of Independence. In that document, clearly, we've done it so many times, but any time that the people decide that the government is abusing them in some fashion, it's not going the way they want to, they can alter it or they can shut it down and start another one. That's the founding document, that the foundation that this country was built on was the Declaration of Independence. He says this: the watershed document of American history is the actual written divorce decree in 1776 against Britain. He's saying that that's what it was, is that the Declaration of Independence was a divorce decree from Britain. It establishes the Founding Fathers' opinion that the government derives its just powers from the people it governs, and that those people may adjust or even replace that government if it abuses them. The Declaration of Independence makes clear that those people are members first, not of the independent nation, but of separate individual states. Now, when it comes to when people say, well, how can a state secede? The Constitution surely wouldn't allow it. Now, that shows abysmal ignorance right there. But don't think that this is only lately that people would say that. This was debated and gone over and we'll see some of the things of it here. By now, every one of you should be able to nip that in the bud right away from someone saying, no state has a legal right to secede because of the Constitution. I hope the first thing that would come to your mind is that maximum that I've said over and over: the Creator is always superior to the creation. And the federal government did not create itself. The states created the federal government, therefore they are superior. It'd be as ridiculous as a parent going to their child and saying, we need to establish a bedtime for you. I can't do it. You're going to be the one to decide what time you go to bed. Does that make sense? And yet, that's the way most people think. What's the other argument that is fundamental that I've taught over and over that you ought to be able to just spit it right out? Why we have the right to secede without anything said about it from the federal government. First of all, let me ask you a question. This will help. Is there anything anywhere in our Constitution, federal Constitution, that says anything about secession? No. Is there anything in the Constitution that says anything about nullification? No. Therefore, according to the 10th article of the Bill of Rights, what does that mean? If it's not specifically stated as an enumerated power in the Constitution, they can't do it. That means the Constitution has squat to say about whether a state can leave or not, and we're going to see what they thought about it at that time. The Articles of Confederation ratified the Constitution of the new United States in 1781. Do you know what that means? Our Constitution that we have today was ratified in 1789. This was the first Constitution. And when they went to Philadelphia in order to amend the Articles of Confederation, they decided this was, by the way, a constitutional convention. And they decided we're going to scrap the whole thing and we're going to start over. And that's one reason I'm against a constitutional convention, is because there's nothing wrong with our Constitution. And if they hold one, the same thing that happened then in 1781 and following, in other words, when they went to that convention, it could happen in another convention that they could just bring up. Once that started, they say, I suggest we scrap the whole thing and start over. And what do you think we would come up with now? I mean, it would be a mess. Anyway, that's not my subject matter here. Anyway, and it served as the current Constitution until our Constitution kicked in 1789 with the new government headed by President George Washington. The second article stated, this is of the Articles of Confederation. I'm quoting the second article here. The second article stated, the second article staked out the state's view regarding who held ultimate political power over them. Quote, each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and every power, jurisdiction, and right which is not by this Confederation expressly delegated to the United States in Congress assembled. What does that sound like to you? Doesn't it sound a lot like the 10th Amendment? That if the power hasn't been delegated to the government by the Constitution, in this case the Articles of Confederation, then the freedom and independence and every power of jurisdiction and right, which is not by this Confederation expressly delegated to the United States in Congress. In other words, they could do anything unless it's stated to the contrary. And that would include what? Nullification and secession. The Articles of Confederation established the Union of States as a confederacy and voluntarily league of friendship. The state declared themselves as sovereign on the human plane over their own destinies. They reserve the right to farm, remain, or not remain in the league with one another, and they convey only specific limited powers to the association of states they have formed. These powers do not include the right to hold them together in any association against their will. End of quote. Now, the reason, why am I talking about secession and nullification and so forth now? I'm going to get to the conclusively why the South did not secede in order to preserve slavery. We'll get into that big time. But first of all, what I want to do is show you that they had the right to secede and they had the right to nullify, and all these states were already trying to do it before the war ever broke out. Here's another quote. Among many planks, the treaty, this is talking about the treaty with Britain, Great Britain, and when they had the treaty with the War of Independence, it says, among many planks, the treaty with Britain acknowledged the states as separate and sovereign entities unto themselves. Thus Britain, too, a foreign power, codified in writing its recognition that the states as free, sovereign, and independent, that was a quote, that is not as one consolidated whole, but as individual states, and that it will treat them as separate individual states. The treaty wasn't with a nation, it was with each individual state that was sovereign. You got that? For the majority of the framers, North, South, and Middle Atlantic of the 1789 Constitution, the bedrock document of the American people, the state's right of secession was not an issue. It was a given based both on the previous documents and on the covenantal nature of the Union. The states themselves held similar views. Three of them, New York, Rhode Island, and Virginia, actually included in their written ratifications of the Constitution statements on the subject of states' rights to secede from the Union. And everybody thinks, oh, well, never heard of this before. In other words, those states wouldn't even ratify the Constitution without making these writing statements that they had that their state had the right to secede from the new Union. New York, Virginia, and Rhode Island each declared that if ever the rights that they granted to the Union were misused to their harm by the federal government or the other states, it was proper for the offended state to resume its right of self-government and withdraw from the Union. Listen to this. Written within the sovereign, free, independent states context of both the Declaration of Independence and Articles of Confederation, the Constitution neither forbade American states to secede nor authorized the federal government to prevent their secession. By the way, I'm leaving out so much. I'm just going to the highlights. By the way, are y'all okay? Y'all got any questions so far that are all right? New England secessionists. Does that grab your attention? New England. I don't know if you can see it. There it is, right there. New England secessionists.
Read a little bit slower, just a little.
Okay. For a long time, secessionist fever burned hottest not in the South, but in the North. Especially the far North, 5 times combinations of the New England states demonstrated their belief in the constitutionality of secession by threatening to do so. This is in the North. The prevailing political sentiment throughout America was that any state, in New England or elsewhere, who wished to secede could do so. Secession was even more ardently defended in both houses of Congress. During an 1848 debate, this was said. This was a debate in 1848. This was the war started in 1861, so it was a few years before then. But this issue of secession was being debated, and listen to this. Any people anywhere being inclined and having the power be thundered. I'm trying to not give something away. Any people anywhere being inclined and having the power have the right to rise up and shake off the existing government and form a new one that suits them better. This is the most valuable and most sacred right, a right which we believe is to liberate the world. Do you know who said that? Abraham Lincoln. 13 years later, when the southern states wanted to exercise the right of secession, which the New England states had threatened, President Abraham Lincoln called it treason. Now, I was just dealing with secession there. Now we're getting to something else. We're getting into the industrial part. How many of you have heard and could explain to me something about the tariff of abomination? You ever heard of that? Probably not, because they don't teach it. Nothing about it, because they say, oh, the war was over slavery. When you hear this, you're going to understand more. This is a quote. The northern onslaught upon slavery was no more than a piece of specious humbug designed to conceal its desire for economic control of southern states. That was a quote by Charles Dickens. The Congress and Senate sought to make foreign products so expensive that the American consumers would prefer to buy American-made items. Let me just tell you, in my own words quickly here, what we're talking about here. You had the North, who was industrialized, and the South had just raw materials. And the South was doing business with Europe, got a better price. And the Industrial Revolution, their industry didn't produce the products because it was kind of new as the quality that they were getting from England. And so for the northern industry to try to do something about that, they went to the Congress, and the Congress, but listen, was no better than it is now, and that's bad. You know how bad that is. And so they decided, well, what we'll do is we'll put a tariff on the goods that are coming in to the South, and it'll make it so expensive that they'll want to do business with us. But you don't, listen, when you hear these, if you have any blood pressure pills, this would be a good time to take them. South Carolina Act of Defiance essentially declared the federal government had no jurisdiction in that state, in that state on that issue. In other words, this tariff was so bad, I'm going to give you some facts about it, was so bad that they said, we're not going to pay it. And, excuse me, Andrew Jackson was the president, and listen what he did. Now, the hero of the 1815 Battle of New Orleans, which was Andrew Jackson, who was president then, mobilized federal troops for use against the people of South Carolina and beefed up the garrisons in the forts of Charleston Harbor. He was ready to invade that state and fight another war. He pushed forth the force bill through Congress designed to use federal military if necessary to force South Carolina to comply with his taxation measures. The real question at issue is this: has the federal government the right to impose burdens on the capital and industry and freedom and liberty of one portion of the country, not with a view to revenue, but to benefit another portion of the country? Is this right? That was what the real question had to be with. Listen to this. This is about this tariff. This tariff's a big deal. It was probably the biggest reason why they went to war. Though comprising less than 1/5 of the nation's population, only 20% of the people lived in the South. They paid approximately 80% of the tariff revenue. The tariff infuriated the Southerners. Lincoln and North's Republican Party congressional forces pressing for more government subsidies of industry increased federal land giveaways to the West. In other words, the North was putting this horrible tariff on the South, and I'll give you some more statistics in just a minute. But they would take this money. None of it would go back to the South. It either went to the industrialization of the North or going west, and the South was paying for it. As the storm of the Southern secession gathered, Northern newspapers supported the Republican Party policies, framed the frightening specter in paper and ink. On December the 10th, 1860, the Chicago Daily Times. By the way, have you noticed that these quotes are by newspapers? They're all quotes. It's not just speculation. They wrote that if the South succeeded in establishing its own tariff or tariff-free points. Let me explain what's going on here. If the South succeeded, the cash cow that the North was getting from these tariffs would end. And if the South had ports that they had a small tariff or no tariff, where are all the countries going to go? They're not going to go north where they have that high tariff. They're going to go to the South. In one single blow, this is what the North was thinking, in one single blow, our northern foreign commerce must be reduced to less than one half of what it is now. Our coastwise trade would pass into other hands. One half of our shipping would be idle at our wharves. We should lose out on our trade with the South, with all of its immense profits. See, that's what they got used to, this tyranny. Our manufacturers would be in utter ruins. Let the South adopt the free trade system, or that the tariffs of revenue and these results would likely follow. Abraham Lincoln thus acceded to the presidency of a nation where an increasing number of people had figured out that the Southern secession, like it or not, might well bring economic ruin to the North. Oh, wow.
Mike?
Yeah.
Was the tariff on the industrial equipment that the South was bringing in, or was it on their cotton and goods?
Well, the tariff, y'all know what a tariff is. It's when something comes in to the country. Yeah, and they would add money to it that would go to the national coffers. But don't listen to this. This is going to explain a lot right here. Just listen to this. The South, with a much smaller population and economy, but much more dependent on imported products because they needed the manufactured goods there, but much more dependent on imported products than the North, paid $90 million tariff. That's 83% of the total. The 20% of the people were living in the South, and they were paying 83% of the total tariff. The North only paid $17.5 million, which is about 17%. The South was paying 83%, which the North would take and give to the industrialization and the move westward. Correspondingly, out of the national total of $261 million in exports, the South did much more exporting too. Southerners' exports counted for $214 million of the $261 million in exports, and the Northern only $47 million. Now listen to this. These exports were typically subject to retaliatory foreign tariffs at the point of designation, with the South shouldering an identical 83% burden of the load. In other words, let me tell you what this is saying. Anything that came into the South, because the Northerners had more people, they had more representatives in Congress, they said, well, let's just build the South. And they said, we're going to put, do you know what percent it was? By the time the war started, it was 60% tariff. Everything that came in, the South had to pay 60% of it to go to the North. Everything that came in. But that's only half of it. Whenever you put a tariff on some country, what do they usually do to you? When you're trying to export something to them, it's the same tariff. So they had to pay not only the tariff that would go into the North, whenever they would export their goods to foreign countries, they had to pay another 50% tariff there as well. They could not survive doing that. Do you understand how horrible, what a debilitation that was?
I'm kind of backing up on Pete's question. Not having lived in that era.
Come on, quickly, spit it out. Hurry. Come on.
What all did the South have to import for their uses in the South? What kind of goods were they importing?
Well, they were importing manufactured goods. And that's what the North resented, because they could get better quality and it was cheaper from foreign countries.
Than it was from
the North, right. See, they had all, they had cotton and they had all these raw materials, and they would export it, and there was that was worked out that way to where they had, what was it? I'll give it to you again here. It says out of the national total of exports, it was 261 million. This was in 1860, one year before the war. Southern exports counted for 214 million, and the northern only 47 million. So they did that much more export. So this tariff hurt them coming and going. It says growing northern congressional dominance drove the tariff higher and higher. Lincoln spearheaded its increase to nearly 40%. By the outbreak of the war, and it was 50% by the end of the war. Now, if you were doing business and you had to pay up to 50% more when you got the manufactured goods you needed in order to operate, and that all went to the north, and then when you exported your raw products to another country, you had to pay them 50% of what the value is, would you be able to stay in business? Do you understand what a big factor this was? I skipped a couple of pages to get there because that was so important. Pennsylvania's most prominent newspaper, the Philadelphia Press, remember, most of these quotes are from either speeches or newspapers. It says, wrote 11 days later, let's see, later than what? Then the news of the secession. The government cannot well avoid collecting federal revenues at all southern ports, even after the passage of secession ordinances. And if this duty is discharged, any state which assumes a rebellious attitude will still be obliged to contribute revenue to support the federal government or have her foreign commerce entirely destroyed. In other words, even after the South declared, after they seceded, became another nation, the North saying, we're still going to get a tariff from you. And that, where that really exploded? Well, I'm getting ahead of myself, but I want you to understand this. Where did the War of Southern Independence begin? Where was the spark that started it? Fort Sumter. It was a federal fort. And it was in another country. It was located in another country, and I'll explain how there was emissaries, and they were pleading and begging Lincoln to remove the forces from that fort because they didn't want a war. They didn't want it to happen or anything. And what you're going to see is, you know why they didn't do it? You know why he didn't agree to it? He'd lose his tariff. Because even in the South, and this fort was located in the Charleston Harbor, he still was going to get a tariff, even though it was located in another country. And the reason, as you will see, that he had 2 or 3 opportunities to stop the momentum and keep the war from happening. You know why he didn't? You know what he said, and it's quoted here? The North would lose the tariff. Is it any shock to you that it was about the money?
Follow the money.
Mississippi's Declaration of Imminent Causes of the Secession stated, quote, there is no choice left to us but submission to the mandates of abolition, which means they'd have to sell all their, they give them freedom and not get any recompense. We must either submit to the degradation and to the loss of property worth $4 billion money, or we must secede from the Union. Suffice it to say that at the time, many other people, North and South, dismissed the claims of slavery being actual justifier of secession. William Tecumseh Sherman, remember him? This is what he said. Listen to this. William Tecumseh Sherman called the issue of the war of the North a pretext for secession. The true cause being, he claimed, the dispute over the tariff. That was from a Northern general. The North American Review, published in Boston, announced that, quote, slavery is not the cause of the of the rebellion. Jefferson Davis himself declared years after the war, quote, "The truth remains." Y'all know who Jefferson Davis is, by the way, don't you? Yeah. Southern president, the president of the Confederate States of America. He said, quote, "The truth remains intact and incontrovertible that the existence of African servitude was no wise the cause of the conflict, but only an incident to whatever extent the question of slavery may have served as an occasion, it was far from being the cause." End of quote. Meanwhile, many of the South's own newspapers, including Charleston Mercury, the New Orleans Daily, and other, pointed straight at the tariff as the primary source of Southern contention with the North. The Crescent was another newspaper. In an editorial in January 1861 said, quote, "These are the reasons why these people do not wish the South to secede from the Union. They, the North, are enraged at the prospect of being despoiled of the rich feast upon which they have so long fed and fattened themselves." These are newspaper quotes. Here's another quote. It says, "The South determined it must stop paying the tariff, and the North determined it must not." Now that's just how do you begin to fight here? And next time, I'm sure I'll get to this next time, that you're going to be shocked. There's some things that I have told two people I'm very close to. And I said, "Did you ever hear this?" And they were like this. This information has been buried. They don't want anybody to know. And they want to keep repeating the narrative over and over. The South was wicked. The South, it's all over slavery and so forth. And I'm just giving you the tippy-top highlights of this. I could go into much more detail. But I'm going to just enough to where you'll get a flavor, so that when you are solidifying this in your own soul and you're hearing all these quotes, and someone says that the monuments need to be torn down because they're a symbol of evil, because the South was evil because it fought the war over slavery. They're just repeating something they heard. They don't know any of this. They have no truth. And I'm doing this so that you will know truth, because isn't that what we're about, is truth? And that's true. The truth will set you free. So I'm past time now, so we'll get into this some next time.
Mike, can I say something just a minute?
Yes.
This was new information to me about the tariff. Is it on?
Is it on?
Yeah, now it is, yeah.
That was new information about the heavy taxation and tariffs, and no matter whether it's on estate taxes, they find ways to take the property away from you, and it's a satanic conspiracy all the way through, and this is what we're seeing. But when we were in Washington, D.C. in 75 and 76, we visited the Ford Theater, isn't that what it's called? Mm-hmm. Anyhow, it's all the propaganda there, but the most enlightening thing was to go into the museum down below in the basement. And that whole campaign of Lincoln was being sponsored by the Order of the Illuminati. The all-seeing eye was over all of their literature and everything. It showed that the satanic conspiracy was guiding this whole thing. And we're not wrestling against flesh and blood, no. But like Ephesians 6 says, it's a spiritual battle. Thanks for teaching us.
Well, knowledge is power. And we should embrace the truth, even though it may seem ugly to us. It is what it is. And we suffer when we don't know the truth and we aren't willing to be open to it, then we lose our freedom. And it's been buried all this time. I just wish there's things that I want to show you that were shocking to me that needs to be known. And I hope that it's important to y'all as well. Let's close. Father, thank you for this time you've given us to delve into the truth of our own history, which has been a mystery to us for a long time. We pray that you will help us to just have an open mind and see that these aren't things made up that people say. That's what we get from the media. That's what we get from most people today, is something they heard. These are facts from newspapers and from speeches and so forth. Most of what I'm reading here is in quotation marks. Help us to, help us to sort this out in our own soul. Not that we're angry at anybody, but we need to know the truth so that we can stem the tide of this insanity that's going on in our country that can tear us apart. Is based on a lie, and that in itself is enough for us to be bold enough to be able to defend the truth whenever and however you lead us to do it. We thank you for this and pray it in Christ's name. Amen.
I just saw this Indian hurricane coming in on Friday.
Nothing hardly surprising. You could say it's coming in tonight. I thought, oh, all right.
I saw it on TV.
Let me tell you, I wouldn't put much stock in what's the TV. That's much less was a man.
That's true. When you see it coming, run.
Well, you know what? If Friday night was interrupted by rain, if it rained in my house, I wouldn't be upset. Good for you.
No.
This is the day of the Lord, is praise, we're going to rejoice and be the best we can.
You got it. That's it. That's the best we can do.
That's good. Yeah, we're going to go. Good to see you. Hey, how are you doing? Sorry, have you got anything set up to live in yet? Or what are you doing with
Well, well, there's a lot to do. I wish I could tell you. Next time, whatever you got,
He's always waiting. That's the biggest problem that hurts ourselves. Cattlemen have a sheepdog and they got horses. They're ourselves.
Well, they say that